Kinshade Stories community, I'm glad you're here. What I'm about to share has not left me since it happened. She walked into my office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and the first thing I noticed was that she was holding her phone with both hands, pressed flat against her stomach, like she was trying to keep something inside it from getting out. She didn't sit down right away. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at me, and I could see she had been crying for a long time before she arrived. Not recent crying, not the kind that leaves your eyes red and wet, the older kind, the kind that dries out a person. She finally sat and she put the phone face down on the armrest, and she said, very quietly, "I just found out that my daughter, the one I raised, the one I have been worrying about for 3 years, she doesn't exist." I didn't ask her to clarify right away. I waited, because in this work, sometimes the most important thing you can do in the first 60 seconds is simply let the air be still. Then she looked at me and said, "There is no daughter. There never was. And I think I made her up. I think I have been telling people about her for years, and I never once questioned it." And that was the moment I knew that what she was bringing into that room was something I had not encountered before. Not like this. Before I go any further, I want to say clearly that every story I share here reflects a real experience, but all identifying details have been changed to protect the people involved. Mental health is not one size fits all. The situations I describe are complex, and nothing in this video should be taken as medical advice or as a universal truth about any relationship. If something in this story resonates with you personally, please reach out to a qualified mental health professional in your area. Her name is Vivienne. She is 43 years old and lives in Des Moines, Iowa. At the time she first came to see me, she was working as an administrative supervisor at a regional logistics company, a job she had held for 11 years. She was divorced. Her ex-husband, a man named Gerald, had remarried and moved to another state. She described their marriage as functional for a long time, then not. They had no children together. She had been living alone for about 4 years. She came to me, she said, because her doctor had noticed she was losing weight rapidly and sleeping fewer than 4 hours a night and had suggested she talk to someone. She didn't think she needed therapy. She came because her doctor had been firm about it. Our first session was fairly standard. I asked about her history, her family of origin, her current support system. She told me she had a good relationship with her sister in Minneapolis. She mentioned her mother, who had passed away 2 years ago. She talked about work. She seemed organized, self-aware, and calm in the way that some people are calm when they have been managing internal chaos for so long that calm is just the surface they learn to keep. I didn't push. First sessions rarely show you everything. It was in our third session that she first mentioned her daughter. She said it the way you say something that everyone already knows, offhand. She was talking about her sleep schedule, and she said something like, "I think part of it is that I stay up worrying about Jade." I wrote the name down. I asked her to tell me about Jade, and she did. She told me that Jade was 19 years old, that she had gone through a rough period in her late teens, and that they had become estranged after a fight about 2 years ago, and that the estrangement had been eating at her ever since. She described Jade's hair, dark brown, curly. She described the way Jade left. She described a Thanksgiving they'd had when Jade was about 12, a specific moment at the kitchen table, the smell of something burning in the oven, Jade making a joke about it. I listened carefully. I asked if I could contact her sister with her permission, just as a way to potentially bring in a support person if Vivienne agreed it would be helpful. She said yes immediately. She gave me her sister's name, Beverly, and a phone number. I called Beverly the following week as part of my standard process for building a broader care picture when a patient gives consent. We were on the phone for about 12 minutes. Beverly was warm, willing to help. I mentioned that Vivienne had been struggling with the estrangement from her daughter. There was a silence on the other end. Then Beverly said, "Her daughter?" I said yes. I gave the name, Jade. Beverly went quiet for a moment longer, and then she said, very carefully, "Vivienne doesn't have a daughter." I asked her to say that again. Beverly said she's never had children. She and Gerald, they tried. They went through some treatments. It didn't work. That was actually a big part of why they divorced. She was devastated. It was years ago, but there's no Jade. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. When Vivienne came in the following Tuesday, I didn't tell her right away what I had learned. I let her lead the session. She talked about a dream she had had about Jade, a dream where they were back in the house where Vivienne grew up, sitting in the backyard, and Jade was small again, maybe 5 or 6, and everything was fine between them. She said she had woken up from the dream feeling the loss all over again, as though the estrangement had happened that morning. I waited until there was a natural pause. Then I said, "Vivienne, I want to talk to you about something carefully, and I want you to know that nothing I'm about to say comes from a place of judgment." She looked at me with the kind of attention that tells you someone already knows something is coming. I said, "I spoke with Beverly this week." She didn't move. I said, "She told me something that I need to understand better with your help." Vivienne looked down at her hands. Long pause. She said, "What did she say?" I told her, quietly, clearly. "Beverly says there is no Jade." The room was very still. And then Vivienne did something I had not expected. She nodded, slowly, like something she had been holding at a distance had finally arrived, and she was watching it come in from across a field. She said, "I know." Her voice was completely flat. No breakdown, no denial, just, "I know." I asked her to help me understand what that meant. What came out over the following 40 minutes was one of the most complex and painful things I have sat with in 25 years of this work. Vivienne told me that when she and Gerald had gone through infertility treatments in their early 30s, they had lost a pregnancy, a late-term loss, a girl. They had already chosen a name, Jade. After the loss, Vivienne had a period of what she called going away. She described it as feeling like she was watching her own life from a few feet behind herself, not quite in it. Gerald had grieved and eventually moved forward. Vivienne had not. She had kept the name, she had kept the idea, and at some point, she could not pinpoint exactly when, the idea had become a story, a real story in her mind, not a lie she told people deliberately, a story that she had come to actually believe. She had told her coworkers about Jade, she had mentioned her to neighbors, she had talked about her in small, scattered ways over the years, never in great detail, never to anyone who knew her well enough to question it, but enough that Jade had become real in her daily interior world. Real enough to grieve, real enough to lose sleep over, real enough to sit in a therapist's office and describe in precise, heartbreaking detail. She said, "I didn't know I was doing it. I think I really didn't know, but I also think some part of me knew the whole time." She looked at the phone, face down on the armrest, and she said, "I looked her up last week, Jade. I tried to find her online, and when there was nothing, I just sat there for a long time, and I thought, of course there's nothing. And it was like waking up in a room you don't recognize." What Vivienne had been living with was not deception in the way most people would recognize it. It was not calculated or manipulative. What it was, and this is something I want to explain carefully, is a form of grief that had been left unprocessed for so long that her mind had built an alternative structure around it. Psychologists sometimes describe a phenomenon called complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, in which the normal process of mourning stalls. The person cannot integrate the loss into their life because the loss is too fundamental, too identity-shattering to simply absorb and move forward from. For Vivienne, losing Jade, the pregnancy, the daughter she had already imagined, the future she had already begun to picture, was that kind of loss, and rather than grief, her mind had offered her something else, continuation, a story in which the loss never happened, a daughter who existed, who grew up, who had a first-grade teacher and a birthday bike and curly brown hair. The estrangement was the most painful detail, because that told me something important. Even inside the constructed reality her mind had built, Vivienne could not allow herself a happy ending. There was no version of Jade in which everything was fine. The relationship was broken. There was guilt. There was distance. Even in the story she had built for herself, she would not allow herself the thing she had lost. She punished herself with the very child she had invented to protect herself. I have thought about that more than almost anything else in this case. When I explained to Vivienne what I believed was happening psychologically, I was very careful with language. I didn't use words that felt clinical or cold. I told her that the mind has extraordinary capacity to protect us from pain that feels unsurvivable. I told her that what she had experienced was not a sign of weakness or instability, but a sign of how catastrophic her loss had been and how alone she had been in it. I reminded her that she had never been given real space to grieve Jade, the real Jade, the pregnancy, the daughter who never came home. Gerald had moved through it and moved on. Her family had been sympathetic, but had not known how to sit with her in it. And so she had carried it alone, and the weight of that had done what unprocessed grief eventually does. It had found another way out. Together, we looked at the timeline. We traced back to the loss, to the period she called going away, to the point where the story of Jade had begun to take shape. I asked her what she remembered from those early years, what she had actually felt before the story became real to her. She said, "Empty. I felt like someone had taken something out of me, and the space was still there." I explained to her that what we were going to do, slowly and carefully, was go back to that space, not to fill it with something else, but to finally, properly sit with it, to acknowledge that Jade was real, not in the way she had been telling herself, but in the way that mattered. A real loss, a real daughter, a real grief that had never been honored. We talked about what it would mean to grieve properly this late. She said, "Is that even possible, after all this time?" I told her that grief doesn't have an expiration date. It sits and waits, and when you finally turn toward it, it's still there, still patient, still asking to be seen. She cried in that session for the first time, not the old, dried-out kind of crying I had seen traces of in her face on day one, the other kind, the kind that means something is beginning to move. We also talked about the people in her life she had told about Jade, coworkers, neighbors. She was afraid of what they would think. I didn't minimize that. It was a real and complicated situation. I told her we would work through that piece together, and that her primary responsibility right now was not to manage other people's perceptions, but to take care of herself. We discussed who she actually needed to tell the truth to and in what order, and I made clear that she had agency in that process. She didn't have to explain herself to everyone. Some of those relationships were surface level enough that Jade simply didn't have to come up again. With Beverly, she decided to be honest. That conversation happened about 2 weeks later. Vivienne called me afterward and said her sister had listened for almost an hour, had not judged her, had cried with her, had said, "I wish I had known. I would have been there." Vivienne is still in treatment. She is doing better, not perfectly, but genuinely better. The weight she has been losing is slowly coming back. She is sleeping more. She told me a few weeks ago that she bought a small photo frame and she put nothing in it, left it empty, and placed it on her bookshelf at home. She said, "It's for her, for the one I actually lost." I found that one of the most quietly profound things a patient has ever said to me in this room. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Have you ever held on to a version of something, a relationship, a belief, a story, not because it was true, but because the truth was too much to carry? Have you ever protected yourself from a loss by refusing to fully name it? Because I think more of us do this than we realize, and I think the first step towards healing is often just the courage to say, "This is what I actually lost, not what I turned it into, what it actually was." If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. Your words matter here, not just to me, but to others watching who may be carrying something similar and haven't said it out loud yet. If you found value in what we discussed today, a like helps this channel reach the people who need it most. And if you're new to Kinshade Stories, please subscribe. There are more of these conversations coming, and I think you'll want to be part of them. Take care of yourselves. I mean that.